Devaya. So we were at the end of chapter 16. We blew through the whole chapter last week, but as a result of that, we didn't get a chance to really focus on a couple of important verses. The last two verses. So in the last two verses of chapter 16, 23 and 24, Krishna says, Ya Shastra Vidhim Utsrijya. So, rejecting the rules of Scripture. One who rejects the rules of Scripture. Vartate Kama Karata. And just acts and moves whimsically, doing whatever they desire to do. Nasa siddhim avapnoti. That person doesn't achieve perfection. Na sukham, nor happiness. Na param gati, nor the supreme destination, which means heaven, liberation. Tasmat shastram pramanam te. Therefore, for you, Shastra is the proof. Karya akarya vyavyasti tau, in determining what is to be done and what is not to be done. Yatva Shastra vidhana uktam. Thus, knowing what is said, what is prescribed in the Shastra, karma kartum iharhasi, you are able to act in this world. Shastra, the word Shastra, comes from the Sanskrit root shash, which means to rule. So Shastra is that which rules, and it is the Sanskrit word, one of the Sanskrit words, for our sacred texts. So our sacred texts are called Shastra, because from Shastra, shush, people are ruled, and therefore the thing which rules human society is known as Shastra, and what rules human society are authoritative literatures. It's actually like it's not possible to have any kind of group large group dynamic or long-standing group dynamic that isn't ruled by some objective system, some objective, authoritative set of rules or guidelines. So it's the nature of if you just do whatever you want to do, that works. Maybe you have a family. You don't do whatever you want to do. You do what your parents want to do. Maybe that works. But if you get a big enough group of people together and you want to figure out what you're supposed to do for a long enough period of time, you have to start to write stuff down. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. This is how we make decisions. Majority rule. It's how you do anything. You got like civil trials, the preponderance of evidence, and then with more significant cases, it's clear and convincing evidence, which is usually like 80% versus 51%. And then when you get to criminal trial, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, which means there's no other logical reason. So a lot of times they'll say it's 99.x%, but you have different, different standards for different types of cases. That's how OJ won the criminal trial but lost the civil trial. There was enough evidence to convict him in the civil trial, but not enough evidence to convict him in a criminal trial. Also, they found evidence after the fact. That was another one. They found a photograph of him wearing those funky shoes. They gave the shoe print, but it came up after the trial, and he couldn't double jeopardy it. And so You have different standards of evidence that's given as we try to figure out how to govern a society. You got laws, you got a constitution, you got federal laws, you got state laws, you got city ordinances, you got guidelines and rules and this and that for almost everything. If it's a big enough group of people and they want to do it over a long enough period of time on a large enough scale, you got to start to write stuff down. I mean, shoot, you need a business plan to eventually run a reasonable business. Scale it, do something substantial. And so nowadays we have a separation of church and state. Like the government of Bengal, of Bangladesh. You guys familiar with the history of Bangladesh? Well, let me lay it on you. First of all, half of our Gaudiya Vaishnava places of pilgrimage are in Bangladesh. Bangladesh was Bengal up until 1947. There was a lot of Muslims. There was a sultanate located in Bengal. They were their own they had their own Muslim invaders that set up shop there. They sometimes aligned with the Sultanate in Delhi. Sometimes they were doing their own thing. Eventually those Muslims were Bengali who ruled, so they weren't from the Middle East. They did their own thing. They had a cavalry, which just allowed them to decimate the Bengalis who were there. They first started going in there in the early 13th century. They took over. And there's a ton of Muslims. Of course, they had a port there, too. That's why the British took over that port eventually. Calcutta was the center of the British Empire. But, a ton of Muslims in that area. Most of them were Hindu converts. You had to pay what's called a jizya tax to be a Hindu. And so you were let off the hook a little bit. There was something called zakat, but you were let off a little bit if you were a poor Muslim. But you had to pay a tax for the privilege of being a Hindu. Plus, you had partial rights. You were really a second-class citizen. You were a dhimmi. You were a second-class citizen. So a lot of Hindus in Bengal converted to Islam. It wasn't like in Indonesia where people converted just because they wanted to by trade and just because they were sharing their culture. There was a massive military element in Bengal, and it was in your best interest to convert to Islam. So there was a lot of Muslims there. And when Pakistan split from India, Pakistan had 55 million people. Bangladesh had 75 million people. Probably traditionally 25% of the population of Bangladesh was Hindu. Now it's 90% Muslim, 10% Hindu. But it's probably 2 to 2.5 times more Hindus were traditionally in Bangladesh. And those Hindus were largely Gaudiyas. There were also Shaktas, kind of two main religions in Bengal. You worship Kali or you worship Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Krishna. We were and are a formidable religious minority in Bangladesh and in Bengal. The Gaudiya Vaishnavas means from Gaudadesh, means from Bengal. Our tradition is from Bengal. Rup Sanat were born in Bangladesh. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mother was born in Bangladesh. Narottam Das Thakur was born in Bangladesh. Half our Gaudiya lineage was born in Bangladesh. Most of the leaders in the Gaudiya Mutt, Prabhupada's guru's organization that spawned ISKCON, most of them are from Bangladesh. It was a huge center for Gaudiya Vaishnavism, for the followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Tons of sacred places, tons of temples. Gaudiya temples, our sacred places. Not like Hindu sacred places, like our places. Not like Badrinath and Rameshwaram and Ayodhya, like loosely related to us, but like our core stuff is in Bangladesh. So anyway, when Pakistan separated, they had Eastern Pakistan, East Bengal, and West Pakistan. And so they split, and that became part of the Muslim split. The Muslims wanted their own country, essentially. So they took the corners off of India. So 1,000 miles of India, but then on either side there was this Muslim place where the Muslims wanted their own country. You follow? All right. So anyway, then there was a few different They had this kind of they all there was 4 different places in Pakistan, and they all came together, and they got ruled together. And then the Bengalis were looked at as low class because Bengal has a pretty significant Hindu aesthetic going on. Muslim women in Bengal wear colorful saris, which they don't do anywhere else in India. They wear like black, kind of like really unattractive black, sort of like, just like burqa type stuff. But in Bengal, they wear colorful saris. And there was Bengal had a lot of like Hindu culture. And so even though Islam was powerful there, they weren't hardcore Muslims the same way they were because they weren't as close to the Middle East. You step out of line, in Afghanistan or Pakistan, they're stringing you up. But you're at the far reaches of the Islamic Empire, and so you kind of get away with more. Does that make sense? Like Islam in Indonesia is a little different too. It's just you're far enough away from where you don't have, Taliban, Al-Qaeda-esque type people rolling through your place, looking to see if a little bit's out of line, they're going to kill your whole family. So anyway, the Pakistanis, they thought the Muslims in Bangladesh were low-class Muslims. They weren't like equivalent to the Pathans, the Pashtunis, the like real Muslims who had more Middle Eastern heritage. So they tried to force them to speak Urdu. But you have Bengali Muslims speaking Bengali, writing in Bengali from the 14th century onwards. So Bengali culture is it's a very distinct culture, very distinct language, heavily Sanskritized, not Urdu, heavily influences Hindi. Middle Eastern language, not so much Bengali. Bengali is mostly Sanskrit. And so they try to force them all to speak in Urdu. But 4% of the population spoke Urdu. So they said no. And Pakistan didn't like it. So they ruled Bangladesh, which was known as East Pakistan, East Bengal. And it was a separate country from India. And it was ruled by Pakistan. But eventually they had elections, and they won because they had 75 million people in their country. So they were allowed to vote. So it was 55 million in West looking down on the masses who were more Hindu, and and the other guys and the Bangladeshis won. And they had Mujib was their guy who won, was become the prime minister. But then they just did a military junta, and they took over, and they wouldn't let Mujib become prime minister. This is in 1970. And so then they imprisoned him, and they thought that there was a whole bunch of self-rule, self-determination. We want to make our own country independent, have our own government. People in Bengal, they're fiercely independent. And so within a few decades, they were really rising up. And so they sent a bunch of Pakistani military people into East Bengal. And they did this genocidal campaign to quell the insurrection by killing tons of Bengalis, Bangladeshis, and reestablish the rule of Pakistan. 9-month war, 500,000 to 3 million people died. 3 million is kind of like the standard number. You talk to a Bengali, it's 3 million. Some people have said it's less, but I tend to go with the 2-3 million number because everything gets underreported in India. COVID cases get underreported. It's just nothing gets properly reported in India. Everybody knows that. Massive genocide. Almost half the population was displaced. And guess who was the target of almost all the violence? Even though they were trying to stop Bengal from ruling itself, it was largely Muslims in Bengal who were trying to break free from Pakistan. Guess who was the target of all the violence? Hindus, yeah. They raped 500,000 women, 250,000, 500,000 women in 9 months. They killed 500,000 to 3 million people. This is in 1971, in a 9-month period. Just to get your perspective, how many slaves were brought over from West Africa to the Americas? 10 million. How many came to the U.S.? 400,000. You get what I'm saying? So we're talking like millions of people were killed in a 9-month period. It's a big number. Big number. And I mean, they would paint yellow H's on the doors of the Hindus, so they knew which houses to break into and kill the people. They killed the men, raped the women. Rape camps, full genocidal rape camps to impregnate the women. They would check you out. They would look at your junk and then see if you were circumcised. Muslims circumcised, Hindus don't. So if they saw you weren't circumcised, they kill you. I just watched a video of one of our devotees getting hacked up with a machete. I don't know if you guys have seen that. I didn't watch it for a couple days because I didn't want to see it, but I finally felt like I had to watch it. A couple of Muslim guys hacking up one of our devotees at the temple with machetes, trying to cut his head off. It looks like they got like pretty deep, like it was kind of like half cut his head off. He survived. And there was another guy with a sika poking out of his head. That's Partadas, stuck in the pakur, dead. And you just see a sika sticking out of the water. So there was a massive genocide that took place, 6 months before I was born, 50 years ago, like practically in my lifetime, in Bengal, totally unreported because nobody cares what happens in India and Bangladesh. It's one of the most populated countries of the world, also one of the poorest countries of the world, and nobody really cares. It's totally underreported. But this just happened, and then 10 million Hindus fled the country, where they've been living for centuries and came across the border as refugees to India, which was just a nightmare. It happened twice. It happened in the 40s, happened again in the 70s. All these Hindus, when it became East Pakistan, there was another massive exodus. Probably the Hindu population was like 35% there at one point, 50 to 100 years ago. But they had these two mass exoduses, and there's still like refugee camps. Like I would go in central India, and you'd find a village of Bengalis in central India because they had just been, they'd had to flee with everything. And then the Muslims would just take over their property. Indiscriminate killing. And then anyway, finally the Bengal won. Pakistan still bent out of shape about it. And they became their own country. And so that's the history of Bangladesh. And so now the population is 90% Muslim. It used to probably be more like 70%, even 65%. But over the last 100 years, over the last 50 years, Hindus have fled that country because of massive persecution and very little in the way of justice. To put it in perspective, when our devotees are getting hacked up, it's kind of like, imagine if a bunch of KK people just like strung up a dozen black people in Alabama last week. It's 2021, and just some white crackers, some honkies, got some black people and strung them up and lynched them, like in a traditional lynching way. You follow? What would be the outrage in our country over that? That's kind of what it is for our specific tradition. All our holy places are there. They've been ruled by really mean Muslims for 900 years, 800 years, something like that, since the early 1200s. Whatever that is, 800 years. It's supposed to be a secular government, but there's massive discrimination and regular violence towards Hindus, and it just blew up and got really ugly a couple weeks ago. And two of our devotees, at least two of our devotees were killed, and I think one more is in critical condition. It might be 1-1 or 2-1, I can't remember. But full hate crime. They burn Prabhupada's Murti, burn the temple down, burn the Rath Yatra carts, and then kill the devotees. So there's supposed to be a secular government. But, in actuality, the government of Bangladesh isn't so secular. There's still this Jamaat, this like radical Islamic element that's, even though it's outlawed in Bangladesh now, there's still like a lot of pro-Jamaat Ismaili sentiment. And so there's this like radical element that's there. You guys didn't know any of that, right? Bengal was our thing. That's our place. It got separated. It's been ruled by Muslims for 800 years. It got separated in the partition 47, became part of Pakistan, then broke free. And when it broke free, while Pakistan was trying to establish control, they just killed a ton of Hindus. And then the people who were living in Bengal already, they also killed a bunch of Hindus because it was an excuse to go out and kill a bunch of Hindus. And so I know tons of Bangladeshi refugees. They just had to leave everything. It just, hundreds of years, their family's been living in the place. They had to leave everything to try not to get killed. And there's still this like exodus, this constant exodus, constant influx of Bangladeshi refugees into Bengal because it just becomes intolerable. Anyway, I got more to say on the topic, but I'm not going to. We'll get back to the verses we're looking at. But just to finish it off, what you're seeing is a reenactment and a greatest hits and a finale and one extra song of what's been done to our particular people for almost 1,000 years. Our particular sect, our particular group. There's millions of us. We used to make up a significant percentage of the population in Bengal. And radical extremists have been killing us off at regular intervals while also ruling us for near 1,000 years. And it just flared up again. And yeah, surprise, surprise, some Gaudiya temples got hit. You read our medieval texts, and it's like the Muslims are coming, and the Muslims did this, and the Muslims did that. It's part of our history. But whereas it's a thing of the past, it's like George Floyd got murdered, cold blood. But the guys who murdered him were going to jail, and everybody freaked out. And he was also a criminal who was just also a victim, because you can be a criminal and a victim simultaneously. That's, sorry, you can't just be. If you're a criminal and then the police use too much force, you're also now a victim. That's how it works. And so you see the kind of outrage that came up in this country when police officers use too much force while subduing a criminal. What you've got in Bangladesh is just some radical extremists taking machetes, coming to our temple and hacking the guy up. Yeah, it's largely unreported around the world, especially in the U.S. What are you guys doing? Largely unreported in the U.S. Okay. So yeah. It used to be that there was no secular government. There was no separation of church and state. People didn't even try. We have a secular government. It's like, one nation, in God we trust, one nation, under God. we hold these truths to be self-evident that our Creator has endowed us with certain inalienable rights. You need your phone in your hand?
No.
Okay. But yeah, so we try to get around it, but it's almost impossible if you're dealing with heavily philosophical issues and issues like fundamental human rights and what's the right of all people in all places. It's really hard to get to that without making a reference to some kind of higher principle that ties us all together. And so you end up getting quasi-religious or downright universally religious. There's just no way around it. If you think about, a police officer pulls you over, why do they pull you over? Well, because it's the law. Why is it the law? Because somebody made it the law. Well, why do they have the authority to make it the law? And ultimately, you get back to the Constitution, and you get back to this idea that this is how the world is set up. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. You get back to big, broad statements like that then govern all the lesser statements. And so really when a police officer pulls you over for speeding, he's really representing God and universal rules of divine justice. You follow? And the rules of man are supposed to reflect those universal rules. Does that make sense? Like police have different ways they can have a conversation with you whenever they want to. But then you can say, hey, am I free to go? If they say, yeah, you're free to go, you can just walk away. They go, well, wait a second. You're like, am I being detained? No, I just want to have a conversation with you. I don't want to talk to you. I'm out of here. Bye. There was like a YouTube video of some kid in New York. Police officer said, hey, what's in the bag? And he said, a whole lot of none of your business, officer. Just walked away. Because he wasn't being detained. When you pull somebody over, you're detaining them. Because no reasonable person will feel like he can ignore the cop and we're just having a conversation. So the mere act of pulling somebody over is detaining them. That's why technically it's a gray area when you get these legal checkpoints where you check people for drunk driving because you're detaining people, but you have no right to detain them because they haven't done anything wrong. You follow? And so it becomes like a thing, like what's the authority to detain every single person when they haven't done anything to warrant being detained? There's a little bit of a gray area. But yeah, even in a traffic stop, there's this idea that you have your freedom, that the government does not have a right to impinge upon your freedom unless there's, just cause. And they have to, it's like a whole thing, even just in a regular traffic stop, the police have to observe. So yeah, ultimately, those cops who pull you over for speeding are representing divine rule and the universal rights of all people. It becomes that philosophical. Legal codes are what happens when you take philosophical ideas and you try to run a society according to them. And it used to be that people didn't even try to separate religion from governing. And so your scriptures were your religious scriptures, and they were also your governing scriptures. In the last few centuries, that's fallen out of vogue, and now you try to at least do like a universal sort of homage to religion, or maybe just try to find secular ways of tying people together and not even bringing up the religious stuff and just enshrining people's freedom to practice religion and then rule the country secularly. But inevitably, you end up talking about big stuff and at least quasi-religious universal concepts. You guys follow this? There's just no way to get around it. Like why? What is it that ties all people together? Why do we all deserve equal rights? Why isn't the law of the jungle? Why isn't it might makes right? Why is it that more intelligent people should be able to get ahead on their own? Why is it that we have to have things like affirmative action? And we have to look out for people who are minorities or disenfranchised to try and equal the playing field for them. Why does it have to be the case? Why is nepotism wrong? Why is pork belly politics wrong? These actually all philosophical issues that get sorted out. And ultimately, you come back to this is the way it is. This is the way the universe is set up. This is what's right. This is what's legitimate. And you make an argument for it, but at some point it's just almost like a evident thing. Like, I'm not even going to argue for it. It's just my axiomatic starting point. This is what our rules are based on. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. You don't agree. We don't care. That's how we're setting it up. That's the rule. That's the law of the land. And if you're standing on our soil, you automatically have to follow those laws. Whether you know them or not, whether you accept them or not, is irrelevant. Social contract theory. Merely by existing in our space, you are obliged to follow our rules. You guys follow this? And there's no man's land. It's not like you go, I don't follow your rules, so I'm going to go to Canada. Every single place you go, every square foot of planet Earth has somebody who's running it. And they have a set of rules. And when in Rome, you got to do what they do. So Krishna's statement here that you can't just reject the Shastra and do whatever you want to do. And if you do that, you won't find happiness or truth. And you need to figure out what the scriptures say. Let that be your evidence. Let that govern your action. And then move in this world. Although it sounds a little Christian, it sounds a little narrow-minded, and like we're way above that. We're not. We have the Constitution and like some kind of nuclear, bunker that can't be penetrated except for by a direct hit. Like that document is practically worshipable. People memorize it. They buy copies of it. They hang it on their wall. It is a deity. The Quran, with its rules of Sharia, is a deity for much of the pious Muslim population. At least a third of the Muslim population, of the 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, believes that Sharia law is for everybody. So you're talking about 650 million people. And even when you get a fully secular form of government, it ends up having to be quasi-religious because you're trying to establish what is a universal rule that should apply to all people in all circumstances. And you have to get highly philosophical. So, Krishna's statement here actually is still the gold standard. Did you follow that? And that leads to Arjuna asking a really interesting question. Arjuna inquired, O Krishna, what is the situation of those who do not follow the principles of scriptures, but they worship according to their own imagination? Are they in goodness, passion, or ignorance? It's kind of a multi-barreled question. They don't follow scripture, they do worship, and they have to be in one of these three categories. Krishna could say, well, they're not in any of those categories. They're in a fourth category. Or they're outside the law. So there's an assumption that Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas applies to everything. And Krishna has mentioned that earlier, so it's not wrong for Arjuna to say that. We did learn that in the 14th chapter. But Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas applies to everything. And now, and it's interesting because Arjuna is saying, okay, what if you don't follow faith? What if you don't follow scripture? Because you just said you got to follow scripture. But what if you don't follow scripture, but you're Shraddhaya Anvita? You are endowed with faith. And Yajante, you worship. So it's interesting. What if I don't do what you say, Krishna, and I don't follow scripture, but I'm still pious and I worship? And something that, is not mentioned in the translation, they worship according to their own imagination. It doesn't say that. It just says they reject the scripture. But of course, Prabhupada does not like people who reject the scripture. So he's like, they worship according to their own imagination. Because if you don't follow the scripture, then what are you following? Your own mind. And so, Prabhupada is an exegete and somebody who was deeply devout and deeply chaste to our scriptural tradition. He sees there's some criticism. But the thing that Prabhupada doesn't mention was it says, they are endowed with faith. Shraddhaya Anvita. Prabhupada doesn't even mention it. So it's an interesting question. You got faith and you're worshiping, but you don't follow the scripture. And this whole chapter, in a lot of ways, is dedicated to answering that question. And Krishna doesn't answer the question to start, but he does eventually answer it through the chapter. We've got to roll through the whole chapter in order to be able to see what Krishna's answer is. But he does actually answer this question. All right, so let's blow it out. Here we go. According to the modes of nature acquired by the embodied soul, one's faith can be of three kinds. In sattva, rajas, or tamas. Now hear about this. All right, so Krishna accepts the threefold division, right? And he says that, yes, your faith is going to be of one of those three. So it's not just you're not just in one of those three. Your faith is in one of those three. You don't just have faith in which one are you in. Your faith is of three kinds. You follow? Which is a little different than what Arjuna said. Arjuna asked, what's their nishta, what's their determination, what's their status? And Prabhupada here is saying their faith is of three kinds. It's very similar, but there's a little tiny adjustment. According to one's existence under the various modes of nature, one evolves a particular kind of faith. The living being is said to be of a particular faith according to the modes he's acquired. She's made it sound like she followed it. I actually find this verse to be incredibly difficult to understand. I don't think it makes sense as a straightforward reading. So you're a little, it makes me think you're just trying to make noises to sound cool, as opposed to actually understanding what's said, because I don't think it's easy to understand the English for this. According to one's existence under the various modes of nature, one evolves a particular kind of faith. The living being is said to be of a particular faith according to the modes he's acquired. All right, so it seems like it's just sort of repeating. You're in the modes, and so whatever mode you're in, that's the kind of faith you have, and so that's the kind of faith you have because it's the mode you're in. Let's look at the actual Sanskrit of the verse, because I think that helps you to better understand what Prabhupada's saying. Sattva anurupa sarvasya, according to the sattva of all. This is interesting because the word sattva is one of the particular kinds of the gunas. But here the word sattva is being used in a more general sense to mean existence. According to your existence, according to your nature, that'd probably be a better translation. Shraddha bhavati, you'll have a particular type of shraddha. So your very nature results in you having a particular kind of shraddha or faith. Again, shraddha, faith, sattva, rajas, and tamas, the three gunas, shastra, the scriptures which rule us. You kind of need to know these terms. It's better to not have to translate them every time. So according to your nature, you'll have a particular type of faith. Shraddha maya yam purusham. A person is made of faith. Literally, Shraddha maya means made of faith. A person is made of faith. Yo yat shraddha sa eva saha. What your faith is, you are. You're made of faith. Whatever your faith is, you are. According to your nature, you'll have a particular kind of faith, and that faith will be in three modes. And therefore, your worship of God will not automatically be in three modes. Does that make more sense? Yeah.
Is faith synonymous with belief here?
Yeah. Faith is usually translated as where you place your trust. Shraddha, what you believe in, sure, yeah. The word faith is used in a religious context in the Gita. It's not used in a secular context. For instance, I could say I believe in whatever, free market systems, I'm like with I'm with the free market Chicago school. Milton et al. I'm with those guys. Those are my guys. And there'd be nothing wrong with making that statement. I believe in blonde hair. You know what I mean? So you could say, I believe in all sorts of secular stuff in English, and it works just fine. You follow? Yo yo yum yum tanum bhakta shradhaya architam ichasi. If a person desires to worship a particular form, then he has a particular type of faith. So the word faith is intimately linked to bhakti in the Gita. And it's always used in a religious context in terms of what you worship. And so therefore it's intimately linked to yaj. Yajante, they worship. So belief in English does not have that specificity. Therefore, belief is a bad translation of Shraddha in the Gita. Religious belief would be a better translation because that specifies its religious belief. Ethos might be better. Ethic might be better. Worldview might be better. But those words also have flaws because they also aren't innately spiritual. So there's kind of no way to get around the idea of a belief in a higher power. That's a core ingredient of Shraddha as it's expressed in the Gita. You may find secular usages of the term Shraddha in Sanskrit literature. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but you might be able to find some, especially modern literature. But at least the way it's used in the Gita, it's used in a very specifically religious context in terms of faith in a higher power. So that's not difficult. Religious belief.
Because aren't you saying about what they worship?
Yeah. That's my evidence, right? That's my worship.
And then later the example of like
We're about to get there. That's right. So those bookends that you just mentioned are why I can make this statement that the word belief is a bad word. Because you can easily use the English word belief to say I believe in whatever. I believe in kombucha. For everyone. That's how we use the word belief in English. So when you want to figure out is that a good translation, you have to think. How do I use that word in English? Now, I religiously believe in kombucha. Of course, there are people who would say, I totally endorse that statement. I believe in kombucha, and they'd be like, yes, my belief in kombucha is religious. But, do they worship kombucha and consider kombucha to be their higher power that's guiding and directing their life? Probably not. They're just trying to be like a hipster and be cool by making, somewhat, I don't know, subversive statements about normal religious mores and how they're limited to things like God, and so they worship kombucha, and they're comfortable saying that because it sounds nifty and cool. But I think if we wanted to look at Shraddha and how it would be best translated in English, I think religious belief, religious faith, spiritual belief, spiritual ethic, spiritual value system. There you kind of need to throw one of those adjectives in to modify the word belief or faith so that it works. So sattvanurupa sarvasya, the existence of everyone. Shraddha bhavati, you have a faith which is in accordance with your basic nature. It's cool because Krishna takes the word sattva, which is one of the three kinds, but then uses it in a more general sense to talk about your nature in any of the three kinds. You follow? So you gotta keep pace with Krishna because he's then using the same word in two distinct ways. Shraddha maya ayam purusha, a person is made of faith. Yat shraddha saeva saha. What your faith is, that he is. He is that faith. So now you got Arjuna asked Krishna, hey, you said you got to follow Shastra. What if I don't? But what if I still worship with faith? Where do I fit in the guna schema? And Krishna says, all right, there are three kinds of people in that situation, but it's really three kinds of faith. And you're really made of your faith, which what drives you, what motivates you. what you value. That's why ethic and worldview works, because a belief could be, again, a belief or faith could just be something that you have in a particular context. But when you say this is what you are, what makes us who we are? It's our belief system. It's our paradigm. It's our worldview. It's our philosophy of life. It's our ethic. That's what makes us who we are. You follow? You guys with me? Yeah. So now belief and faith don't work. It's more like your spiritual worldview, your raison d'etre, your fundamental operating system. You guys following us? Men in the mode of goodness worship the demigods, those in the mode of passion worship the demons, and those in the mode of ignorance worship ghosts and spirits. Okay. All right. So people who are sattvic, they worship the devas. People who are rajasic, they worship yakshas and rakshas. It means they're worshiping kind of like higher powers, but low-class higher powers. There's a show called American Gods on, I don't know, Stars or FX or something like that. It's a cool show. Mason likes it. So he just gave me a thumbs up. That's how I know. It's not like we sit around talking about our favorite TV shows all the time, but I caught that out of my peripheral vision. American Gods is interesting. Anyway, it's about gods in America who are all demiurges. They're sort of like superheroes, really. But they get their energy from people worshiping them. So that's like the food they eat. And they become powerful the more people worship them. So it's funny because at one point they have Jesus come on. And there's like 100 Jesuses hanging out. And because there's so many different conceptions of who Jesus is. And so you got like your muscular, angry Jesuses. And you got like a little kid Jesuses. And you got like your traditional, turn the other cheek Jesuses, like a hippie kind of Jesus. And so there's all these different Jesuses because people have different conceptions of Jesus. And therefore you can't just have one Jesus, you got to have a whole bunch. You follow the... it's interesting that they did that. It's like when you talk about yakshas and rakshas, you get these, they're kind of like divine beings, but they're a little bit malefic, kind of like genies, the gene, and sort of like that, maybe a little leprechaun action or some kind of elf type thing, wizards and warlocks, that type of stuff. So people who are in the mode of goodness, they're worshiping devas, plural, kind of your standard Hindu. And people in the mode of rajas, they're worshiping a lower class conception of divinity. You follow? Like Loki in Nordic, in the Nordic mythological tradition. You follow? And really Hermes is his Greek-Roman counterpart. Mercury, Hermes. So you got like your big gods like I don't know Zeus, Apollo, but then you got your sort of like you got Hades, Kronos. You got these sort of minor deities in the pantheon that you might worship, and they're not quite as rosy-cheeked and whitewashed. They're a little darker, a little more twisted, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about. You might also be able to slip in here if you are a groupie, if you're codependent. Functionally, you might end up replacing the role God should play in your life. Because if we're talking about your ultimate ethic and what determines your behavior, then in a codependent relationship or somebody who's totally sold out and they're a groupie or they're like, like a Trump freak, then, it starts to be like you saw that. There was a whole religious iconography that came up around Trump Or Trump, they'd have like Trump on their altar. And like Trump like as Jesus. And Trump as the Messiah. And the whole QAnon cult was really the deification of Trump. Like it was actually the birth of a new religious movement. And so you start to look at the qualities of the person that they're worshiping. Like what was Trump worshipped for? His goodness, his fundamental like kindness and compassion and depth and sobriety and philosophical nature and like his deep thoughtfulness and care for all living beings. No, he was worshipped for power and his cavalierness. And he didn't care. And he bucked the system. You follow? That was the attractive feature. There's a whole bunch of women who were into Trump because they felt like by aligning themselves with him, sort of like in a fascist way, by aligning themselves with him, then they'd become powerful too. Maybe they were victims of rape. And they actually interviewed a bunch of women who really got into Trump, but they were victims of rape or something like that. They're like, this guy is that same kind of person. Like, yeah, but if I'm like with him, then those things will never happen to me again. Like it was a sort of fascist thing where you have this Christ-like messianic figure, whether it be a Mussolini or a Hitler type figure, or or like a Fidel Castro type figure. You get these people where they really become the core feature of a group of people, and you align yourselves with them, and then that gives you credibility. You guys following this? Anyway, some of that, and then you got like the straight up dark arts stuff. Like you got the straight up ghosts and goblin worship, the pretas and the bhutas. So Krishna, says there's three types of things. We might have to flesh this out because this was spoken in the Hindu pantheon. The world's a little different now. Monotheism is all the rage. And so this idea of a polytheistic worldview where you're looking at different types of deities isn't as in vogue unless you start looking at the different conceptions of Christianity. Again, in the early days of Christianity, Christ was a warrior who conquered death, who fought death and won. King Christ. That was the way Christianity spread all over Europe. It wasn't this like, this androgynous, bleeding heart, masochistic figure. It wasn't that. That was later. That was like a later Catholic thing they got into at a certain point historically. But the early church, King Christ conquers death. That's how they would preach. Christ fought death and won. Death couldn't even defeat Christ. And so if you worship Christ, you'll become powerful. And death won't be able to defeat you, and you'll beat your enemies. That's how the Germanic hordes got into Christianity. So different than what we think of as Jesus.
Earlier in the Gita, Krishna said that Jaganya Vishaya Veda, the Vedas simply have to do with the three modes of material nature. And then here it's saying if you don't follow scripture, then you're in the three modes. It seems kind of
No, he didn't say if you follow the scriptures, you're not in the three modes. He hasn't said that yet. He says, Arjuna says, if you don't follow the scriptures, but you still worship, what mode are you in? Do you still have value? Because you just told me to follow the scripture. He doesn't say if you do follow the scripture, you're not in the three modes. There's nothing like that. So there's no contradiction with that statement, Triguna Vishaya Veda.
it seems implied, but it's not.
It's not implied. You have a worldview where you think it should be implied. But there's nothing in those verses that suggests that Krishna says the Shastra is Nishtraigunya, or the Shastra is Nirguna. In fact, this whole section talks about if you follow the scriptures, then you're in the mode of goodness. If you follow the scriptures in giving charity, then you're in the mode of goodness. If you follow the scriptures in terms of austerity and do swadhyaya, study of the scriptures, then you're in the mode of goodness. And so, do you understand this question? So it's not, the chapter doesn't actually bear that out. The implication is because we're raised as devotees and we think our scriptures are spiritual. Krishna has a pretty harsh view of scriptures in the Gita. He regularly critiques the scriptures. Not just in the verse you're quoting, but throughout the text. So there's no indication you're beyond the gunas if you follow the scripture. Now he does say you'll go to param gatim, sure, but that's a lot different than saying it's beyond the gunas. Anyway, let's keep going, yeah.
So the distinguishing factor is bhakti is not following the scripture.
Now listen, you gotta listen, don't do this. He's going down the wrong road. Now you've joined him. That's not what we're doing. I'm trying to follow the text. That's why we're looking at the text. Do you see bhakti anywhere in this text? It's not. We're not discussing bhakti. Do you see anything about being beyond the gunas in these texts? We don't. So we're not discussing that. If you guys want to understand a chapter, we gotta Krishna's given us enough to chew on its own, without us then contextualizing it. You're gonna have a hard time just following what he's saying without contextualizing it. If you try to contextualize it all, you won't grab it. Like if you're learning a new move and then you want to contextualize it within the overarching your philosophy of life, it's not going to work. Learn the new move, and we'll talk about it after you get the basic mechanics down. You got it? So let's just recap. Follow the scripture. What if I don't? But what if I still do religious stuff? Where am I at? All right, faith is important. Faith is a factor. I didn't mention faith when I talked about following the scripture. Krishna in the 16th chapter doesn't talk about faith. He just talks about following the scripture. So it's almost like Arjuna's wait a second, where does faith come in all this? Can I sever the two? Is faith only for people who follow the scripture? Or can I have faith and not follow the scripture? And Krishna says, yeah, all right. You're right, faith is a big factor. Has he answered the question of how does faith interface with scripture? Because that's really Arjuna's question. You reject scripture, but you have faith. What does that place me? Has Krishna described someone who rejects scripture yet? He is not. He's just talking about faith. So Arjuna asked a question about rejecting scripture. Krishna has not answered a question about rejecting scripture. Krishna is running in a particular direction to explore the concept of faith or shraddha that Arjuna has introduced, but he has not contextualized it and mixed it up with following the scripture yet. You guys with me now, right? So Krishna's not answering Arjuna's question. He's jumping off on the word faith that Arjuna has introduced and looking at that in its own world. That makes sense? Those who undergo severe austerities and penances not recommended in the scriptures. See that? Ashastra vihitam. It's not ordained in the scriptures. It's gora. It's horrible. Tapyante. See that? Ye tapajana. People who undergo, who perform austerities that are horrible and not recommended in the scripture. Performing out of pride, egotism, who are impelled by lust and attachment, who are foolish and who torture the material elements of the body, as well as the super soul dwelling within, as well as me who dwells within. That's actually what Krishna says. They are to be known as asuras. Okay. Is that an answer to which mode are they in? It's suggestive of tamas, because it says they're asuras, right? And if everything's in the three modes, it would sound like they're in tamas, right? But we have here a criticism of self-mutilation, of violence in the name of spirituality. It's a criticism of, mutilation, extremism, violence in the name of spirituality. Because you're actually torturing God who exists within your own body. And you're not following the scriptures, because ostensibly the scriptures don't recommend such stuff. Now he's brought in the scripture, right? So if you have faith in these things, which seems to go along with the last line of the tamas, of the last verse, would seem to now have springboarded into these two verses. Are you guys following this? They're worshiping the demons and the goblins, and they're doing this kind of stuff. They're in tamas. And tamas, the feature of tamas is it's not recommended in the scripture. Rajas and sattva, I'll just give you guys a little glimpse, are recommended in the scripture. Rajas is recommended in the scripture and it's done with a pure heart. Excuse me. Sattva is recommended in scripture and done with a pure heart. Rajas is recommended in scriptures, but you're doing it to get ahead. Both Rajas and Sattva, you're going to see, are according to the scriptures. Tamas breaks from the scriptures. So, if you don't follow scriptures, but you have faith, you're in tamas. If you follow the scripture and you have faith, but you're materially motivated, you're in Rajas. If you follow the scripture and have faith and are purely motivated, you're in Sattva. We don't really want to be in any one of those. And so at the end of the chapter, Krishna will tell you how to jump past Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas altogether. Do you guys follow this? So we're bringing now in the scripture, but we know we're 5 and 6 verses in before we bring in the scriptures, and he hasn't meshed it together yet. We're going to mesh it. I did it for you guys because class is over, and we're going to wrap things up in a second. But so just to recap, Krishna says, got to follow the scriptures. Arjuna says, what if I don't? But I still worship and I have faith. Krishna says, faith is a really important thing. We're made of our faith. And yeah, faith is in the gunas. And and what your faith is really who you are. And if you're in goodness, you'll worship the gods. In passion, you'll worship materialistic people or a lower conception of divinity. And then in ignorance, you worship these ghosts and demons, and you torture your body, and you torture the bodies of others, and you actually hurt me, and you're not following the scripture. So if I'm not following the scripture, and I'm in tamas, then ostensibly those in Rajas and Sattva are following the scripture, and you'll find in the rest of the chapter that's borne out. Like what I've just introduced. It's not fully galvanized yet, but the rest of the chapter will bear this understanding out. Now, I don't know. What if I'm just in goodness, but I never follow a scripture? Could that happen? Could you be on a desert island and you worship in goodness without following the scripture? You're selfless, like Krishna says, right? But you don't have a scripture, so you can't follow it, right? I think we can make an exception for that guy. But we're not talking about... Now, here's the thing. Okay, here's the thing. Check it out. You ready? Okay. If I'm in the mode of goodness, then I will recognize those things which are also in the mode of goodness. And therefore, when I encounter the scripture, I will appreciate it and value it and see the legitimacy of it. In lieu of such a scripture, I may have to write my own book, go according to beat my own drum. Just like, if there's no hospital around, you might have to sew somebody up. But if you really care about your loved one, and there is a hospital, and there's a legitimate medical facility available, are you going to force him to get some jagged Frankenstein, you know what I mean? No, you're going to take him to the hospital. And so when you do encounter scripture, you'll appreciate it, and you'll abide by it because you'll see the value in it. Do you follow that? I personally don't believe that, without a scripture, you have to be in the mode of Rajas and Tamas. I could see through a natural theology somebody figuring out they should be vegan and they should, love their fellow man and the God's in everyone's hearts. Those seem like pretty high concepts. And they could do that without encountering our specific tradition or any religion for that matter. But if they did that and then they met us and heard about our text, they'd be like, wow, your texts are cool. That's the same kind of stuff I believe. It's like, I hate your text, and I have to do this all on my own, and I can never follow anybody. And I have to, if you're going to walk down that road, I have to walk across the mountain because I can never follow the path that somebody else has followed. Even if it's the quickest way to get to the hospital, I will walk over the mountain. So I never set foot in the footsteps of any other person because I can never do anything that anybody else does. I don't even speak English because somebody else has spoken that language first. So I just speak random gibberish at every moment. Then obviously you've got some kind of major issue, Got some kind of antisocial personality disorder. You follow?
Yeah.
So if you find the scripture, then you'll appreciate it. If you find the scripture, you'll appreciate it. I wouldn't want to limit and say nobody could ever be in goodness unless they encounter our books. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes back to life. No one goes back to the Father except through me. I don't think we need to do that. And so I'd soften that one little element of what Krishna said. Of course, he's speaking in a country where the Shastra was well known and universally accessible. And so everybody would have had access to that. Interestingly, I think this works as a metric to judge religion. And so when your religion is promoting killing people for believing the wrong thing, it's a pretty good sign you have the wrong conception of religion. Now, is that Muhammad's fault? Maybe not. Maybe they're twisting up his words. He seems to have left a lot of room for people to get to this conclusion. It seems like there's a lot of problematic verses in the Quran that really are pretty easy to reach this conclusion from. And his lifestyle was pretty violent. He was a 7th century warlord. And so, do you have to have this reading of this text? No, you don't have to. Are there Muslim apologists out there? Yeah, I want to be friends with those guys. Let them preach to their brethren to stop the madness. But if the stuff is really easy to misinterpret, and people are regularly misinterpreting it, at some point that starts to fall back on the teacher. You follow? And so, I don't want to unnecessarily criticize somebody. At the same time, I don't want to just do forget to mention the emperor wears no clothes if it's applicable. But regardless of that, you look at what happened, it's just classic religion in the mode of ignorance. Violent religion, torturing people for believing the wrong thing. What made the whole thing hit was it was Navaratri. It's a big Shakta festival, Durga Puja, super popular in Bengal. So some of the Muslims got fired up. They got pissed. These Hindus walking around, worshiping whoever they want to. They're offending the Quran by their idolatry. We should go and deal with them. We got to go and deal with this. Their very existence upsets me. And man, that's like the genocide of 71 all over again. They were trying to fight the Muslims, but they just killed a bunch of Hindus. That's what it became. It became a genocide of Hindus. What they wanted to do anyway. To purify Bengal. Get rid of all the Hindu elements. All right, we're done. Thank you very much.